Hey there, this is Dan, the producer of Mark and Carrie. If you like this show, we highly recommend you check out Watson's other podcast, Trending Globally. You'll hear more in-depth conversations about politics and policy from some of the world's leading experts, including, occasionally, Mark and Carrie. You can find it by subscribing to Trending Globally on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, on with the show. Thanks.
Well, hello, and welcome to the podcast. Hi, Mark. Can I help you with your car insurance today? I always feel like I'm working customer service when I wear this headset.
That is totally a customer service headset. It's really good. I was actually I should have had a shave before I got on. I mean, if you're watching this on YouTube, these jokes will make sense, but if you're listening to it, they won't. I haven't had a shave, but I am wearing my glasses, which I always think makes me look kind of strange.
They're smart glasses, maybe. Make you look.
Are they the smart ones?
Yes, intellectual.
Okay, right. So,
yeah.
These are my smart glasses. All right, fair enough. So, it's been 2 weeks. I mean, nothing much has happened.
No, not really. And in fact, you feel like it's more of the same with slightly different terms used. But on a more serious note, actually, yesterday was a big day for the Supreme Court. This is one of the latest, yesterday's decisions were some of the latest decisions that we've gotten. And part of it was that they had to hear some of the cases over Zoom. We remember some of those discussions. But the interesting ones from this week were in Oklahoma. Justice Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion that the eastern part of Oklahoma is considered tribal land. And so the question before the court was whether this area of land, which was under a treaty from 200 years ago, was federal or whether under federal law or whether it was tribal land. And the decision that Gorsuch wrote was that it was reserved land. Now, the implications of this are not yet 100% clear, but mostly that Gorsuch wrote the decision, the political stuff coming out of this, Gorsuch wrote the decision. I mean, it's not totally surprising because he's from the West, he's from Colorado, but also that he sided with the liberal part of the court. And so that sort of stuff is interesting as we think about as the president often tweets about his justices and, President Obama's justices and that sort of stuff. And then Senator Ted Cruz, who's from Texas, you might think he has other issues going on in his life, but he tweeted that what was next, Manhattan. So, I mean, I just thought that was really relevant.
So is this a kind of a blowback from what happens when you think that straight constitutionalists are always going to act in your interests?
Yes.
Because, if you think about it, what I understand of this one is that essentially there's a legal case here that the law was never superseded by federal law. Therefore, as a strict constitutionalist, I must take the letter of the law. Boom, that's what you get. So it seems to be the case that, if conservatives are banking on people like Scalia and Gorsuch, who are the so-called strict constitutionalists, adhering to the letter of the law, sometimes the letter of the law can throw up some surprises.
Yes. And especially in cases that might seem very straightforward to one side of the spectrum versus the other. I mean, this was a surprise, and especially again because you had one of Trump's justices writing the majority decision, and then the two big ones that everyone was waiting for. And I was like, doom scrolling through Twitter on this yesterday morning were the Trump tax ones, and so I was interested in this from a presidential power perspective. So there were two cases, one having to do with the Manhattan district attorney, whether or not they were going to have access to Trump's records, and then Congress, whether Congress was going to have subpoena power. And so the presidential power perspective on this was that the court said and really questioned in their decision whether Congress has the subpoena power, and actually said in it that the power that Congress was asking for was too far-reaching, and then kicked it down to the lower court. So this isn't really a win or a loss for the president. It's just more litigation and more courtly legal stuff. And then on the
stuff, hold on, didn't it allow the Manhattan DA access to the files for criminal prosecution?
Yes, it is. So on the second one with the Manhattan DA, that's exactly right. The grand jury will get access to that, though I think it still has to be decided by the lower court as to the parameters of that. But what was interesting about that was that Trump, the president, had said that as president, he is immune from criminal subpoenas, and the court loudly rejected that. So it's kind of similar to US v. Nixon, where the court said, on one hand, you have to give up the tapes, but on the other, we recognize executive privilege, and so giving the president more power. I saw these two cases as saying Congress doesn't have power to subpoena you unless it's really specific, which was interesting, curbing congressional power, but then saying the president doesn't just have this blanket immunity. So I think always kind of like pushing a little bit against presidential power, but never really wanting to curb it all whole hog.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there was a win for religious conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a fight over birth control, and you kind of, but this was part of the Obamacare, and that there had been a section that allowed employers to opt out of providing free birth control, and so the court said that that is the case, that religious employers can opt out of this, and it seemed to be a bit of a whimper in comparison in terms of the decision magnitude as compared to the Oklahoma or the Trump tax cases. But it's not a surprise. I mean, it's a continuation of the, the contraction of access for women to birth control.
So it's been a good week for the president or a bad week for the president?
From the SCOTUS rulings, I think it's a bit of one step forward, two steps back. So there's probably some terrible metaphor that I'm using. But I think probably not the greatest, because there's stuff is still going to happen at the lower courts. Everyone says nothing's going to happen before the election. But the other thing that I keep thinking of is that Trump is no idiot when it comes to this. I mean, he doesn't do his own taxes. I mean, if anything, his lawyers are lying for him, right? So if there are lies or fraudulent claims or whatever, he's going to just blame the lawyers and the accountants, isn't he? I mean, it's not like he's doing this like at night on his computer or something using TurboTax.
Well, exactly. This is why audit firms are sort of double-edged swords. On the one hand, they verify your account. On the other hand, they take the fall for what you have done or what they have done or what someone has done, which is sometimes a bit opaque. But his travails this week have gone a little bit further than just this. I mean, apparently he didn't do his own SAT test. What else?
Oh, yes.
There's that thing called Corona, right?
Yes,
there's that thing called Corona. It's 130,000 dead, as completely predicted and was predictable. All those states that opened up 4 weeks ago now, that whole period of the deaths are going down seems to have abruptly ended, and they're going back up again. Remarkably, despite all that, Trump still has 50% of people thinking his handling of the economy is okay, which is something I honestly cannot understand, but there we go. And the base is still the base, and it's still there. So despite everything that's thrown at him, despite the fact that his July 4th speech was basically the declaration of a culture war, right? It seems to be, he's still in there. And, Joe Biden's still struggling to get a hearing. So, again, as my resident American politics person, make sense of all that for me.
Well, I think the economic approval number is so interesting because it's at 49%. And I thought maybe he's not doing a bad job on the economy, minus the whole pandemic thing. And people are like, well, I was somehow giving him an out, because they're like, oh, well, COVID screwed everything up, not seeing his role in the COVID screw up. So there's that.
And the official unemployment number is still only really 12%. If you go with one of the bigger measures, you can get there. But it's not what we were expecting or were told to expect, that a third of all people are going to lose jobs in the pandemic. So essentially, despite the economy doing very badly, particularly in soft touch services and bars opening and closing and all this sort of stuff, airlines are a catastrophe, there's going to be much more unemployment coming in the next few months, unfortunately. But at the present moment in time, for many people, I guess if they look around and they still have a job, that's not the problem. There may be various problems, but he's still getting, it's not really his fault. That could be, exactly what it is.
Well, and I think the culture war speeches, and especially the tearing down of the statues and the radical left, I mean, that stuff obviously is gaining traction because he's used that speech now, both at Mount Rushmore and then on 4th of July. And you see some ads around this as well. You see this is clearly going to be the strategy for them because they're not going to win in the fall, especially because unemployment numbers will be higher. They can't win on that they, contained the pandemic. So the culture wars is really all he has to lean on. In order to make the case to the country. And so in that way, you just it's a pretty good playbook, I guess, because you focus on the stuff that you can control. The liberal left is going crazy, or the radical left is going crazy and tearing down all these statues and, full on, you can't say that, you can't say that. And so I think it's a good positioning for him, and it sticks too.
So it's good for the base. It solidifies the base. Does it really get him, into victory territory? That's the question. I mean, the polls, for example, on the continuing protest still show that a majority of Americans think that they're on the right side. So the ability to play the classic Southern strategy, maybe it finally has, diminishing returns to that strategy. But the econ numbers do suggest elsewhere, that it is actually working.
But what does this look like in the fall to you in terms of the economic data? I mean, it just looks like garbage, right?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it's kind of weird, right? Because if you were at any other country, right, your numbers are going down, right?
Yes.
It's a very interesting. There was a great piece in the Financial Times by Simon Cooper last weekend where he said, look, there's this wonderful piece of this essay by a philosopher called Harry Frankfurter, who's at Princeton. It's called On Bullshit. And the characteristic of a bullshitter is someone who, they don't care about the truth value of a statement, right? That doesn't matter. So if you call them out on being a liar, it's irrelevant. The only reason you say something is because it has affect. It makes you feel a certain way, and it gets them what they want instrumentally. So Trump, Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, what they have in common, they literally are bullshitters under that definition. Now, the thing is, the virus doesn't care if you're a bullshitter or not. The virus doesn't care if you're wearing a mask or not. And if you start to believe the bullshit and you don't wear a mask and you're in a state that opens up, it is inevitable that you're going to end up closing down the economy again. So the harder that he pushes on this line, the more damage he's doing to the economy itself. And that seems to me to be the pressure point with his own supporters. Whereas up here, for example, in Rhode Island, cases down, right? We're looking like New Zealand in comparison to other parts of the United States. The whole of the Northeast, mask country, liberal country, seems to be doing okay, and we're on phase 3 of opening. Meanwhile, Texas and those other places that opened up that we spoke about in prior episodes, it's a disaster. And if you keep going that way, you will continue to open and then crash and then open and then crash. That's where the problem lies when he gets up to November.
Well, and there's a great article in Politico yesterday about Governor Raimondo and why it is Rhode Island is doing as well as it is. But you have, to your point about the regional differences, so if the South then sort of starts to decrease, and does the Northeast then start to increase? The fall just looks like, it could be just scattershot around the country. The fall does not look good, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
So let's bring that into more pointed areas. So universities and schools opening up in the fall, right? So the first one is something that I take personal affront to because I was one of them. International students being banned.
Yes.
So 2 weeks ago, we have the ban on basically green cards and anybody coming in, and now international students. Now, the interesting one on this is actually under existing law, not that much of a stretch. Because you do need to be enrolled face-to-face, because otherwise what would happen is you have lots of people on student visas who could be sitting anywhere in the world pretending to be in a class, and you're essentially handing out visas. You need to know where people are and that they're there doing the things that they want to do. But this has been weaponized by the administration as yet another all foreigners are bad move. Let's keep them out. And 1.2 million people who are here, who are an incredibly important part of the basic research infrastructure of the United States, are now looking around going, what just happened?
Well, and the rule is written, so you don't know whether they have to be in face-to-face in person once per semester, twice does the professor have to be there as well? And so the rule is so vague. And of course, no one at DHS is saying what the details of the rule are. And then to your point about the economy too, this is a ton of money that they're pumping into the economy as well. I get the xenophobia and all that sort of stuff, but I just think about the business side of this, and that's a huge business to universities and higher education.
But that's why I think that, to go back to it, the Frankfurt bullshitter category is really useful, right? Because if this was a normal Republican president, you know that he would be getting hell for tariffs from business. He'd be getting hell for tariffs for his immigration policy. And he is getting hell from business, but he doesn't care. Because ultimately it's all about one thing, saying what's effective to get elected. It doesn't matter really what it is. If you imagine a Democratic equivalent of this, it would be somebody that would be facing down their own team. Exactly the same thing. right? Not because it's a good idea, but because it's effective. So does Trump really genuinely think that banning green cards in progress is going to help the unemployment numbers? Absolutely not. How would you connect the dots? It's ridiculous, right? But it's popular. It speaks to basically that sotto voce racism that's come to characterize the culture war move. And that's where we are.
But it's such an interesting point, because it means there's no fact. Fact does not matter. So when people, number of Pinocchio noses and that sort of stuff, I mean, like, none of that is relevant, because he's just saying stuff, tear down those statues. What are they doing? They're crazy.
Right.
And that just makes some of us feel good.
But this isn't, so this brings us to the sort of the bring back free speech, protect free speech move, the Harper's letter, all this sort of stuff. So here's how I think about this one, right? So apropos what we've just been saying, the right for the past 30 years has been winning by giving up on facts. It basically does affect, how it makes you feel. And what they did was they said, these are our values. And they turn values, rather from sort of contingent historical products that we think are good at a certain moment, into absolute truth, 10 Commandments style. And essentially you're for us or you're against us. And that was sort of the right-wing move. This is what's residualized the base. This is what's made primaries so toxic, right? You either subscribe to these views or you don't. That's the end of it. Now, what's happened on the left, right? Interestingly, what the center left, the Harper's letter signatures, are doing is getting onto the so-called far left, right, for their intolerance and cancel culture and all the rest of it. But if you think about it, in an arms race, it's an equivalent move. And it's a very effective politics. But what it means is both left and right are now playing kind of values absolutism. Now, in the middle of that, there's a bunch of people who basically have done well for the existing system, my class, who are saying, what about free speech? Well, you're like, well, really? This is the moment to talk about that? Because let's think about it. All those Confederate monuments put up in the 1930s, that was an example of free speech. Jim Crow, that free speech was alive and well all the way through that, right? So it's a bizarre, if you're not in the bubble that is my class, right, that is such a weird intervention into this moment, because both to the left and the right, who are playing kind of moral absolutisms, it literally makes no sense. It's literally not legible as anything other than a bunch of old people trying to be relevant in the middle of a screaming match.
Well, and I agree with everything you just said, and I've thought a lot about this because I've been trying to sort this out for myself, and I think about in class, or how I'm super careful about what I say, because I don't want to hurt my students if I say the wrong term, and I have gotten emails from students that have said, you said this, and here's what you should be saying, and sent me a handbook. And I mean, I've taken that to heart, in that I know that I hurt that student. I mean, there's also part of me that's kind of annoyed, like, seriously, I didn't, but I take it for what it is, and they're doing a good faith effort. But I think it really is, and I can understand it from just a generational perspective of, like, I don't know what words I can use or what words I'm not supposed to. And so in some ways you kind of feel like, JK Rowling's just pissed because she got yelled at on Twitter for saying the wrong stuff, although it's much more than that. And she just doesn't know how to, like, she feels so embarrassed. She just can't say, I'm sorry, and I'll do better next time or something. And so that she signed on to this letter.
So the sociologist Bourdieu had a nice way of thinking about this, which was, he said, financial capital, wealth, is one form of capital, but there's also cultural capital, and there's also social capital. And what this class, our class, has is basically kind of cultural capital. And what's happened is what we are selling just isn't valued by either of these constituencies. So you're watching people react to the devaluing of their, if you will, their intellectual and capital in that sense. So...
But I mean, there is a part that I think that I can be empathetic to within this bigger conversation. And, I just catch little bits of this, is when, for example, there's a new term that's used, and I mean, and I should have heard of it, but I haven't. And so then you're like, but I must be out of date. I'm totally out of it. And there is this feeling of frustration, but I guess I don't know, talk to me in 30 years, I guess, and I'll be that grumpy person that has signed this letter. I guess is this generational? And is it just a bunch of grumpy old people?
Right. Yeah, I mean, all of the above, right? And it's more important than that. But I mean, there's a reason I'm a political economist. I posted something on Twitter this morning or yesterday from a PricewaterhouseCoopers report on wealth, right? So high net worth individuals, people who have more than $1 million in assets, right, have more wealth than all the world's pension funds and all the world's insurance companies combined. And they have 10 times that of all the sovereign wealth funds. Now, we can scream about statues, we can do everything, but that's the underlying reality, right? So, you can get involved in any politics of recognition or misrecognition you want, but at the end of the day, the same people still control all the power and the wealth.
Yeah, and that was a big
that's
push.
the bit that this is what's missing in all of this.
Well, that was a pushback, not in terms of the actual dollar wealth, but that JK Rowling, for example, has so many platforms and speaks to so many people. And so is she really a victim of not being able to say what she wants to? I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, on this not being able to say or do what you want to, yet another day and another video of someone yelling at somebody at the grocery store when they're asked to put on a mask. What do you make of all of this about my freedom, and then screaming and cursing someone out for when they're asked to wear a mask?
So the first thing to recognize is that it's not just the United States. This actually does go in other places, right? There are reports of this. In other places. It's not as extreme. But for example, if you talk to people who are in Britain, if you're in the northeast of the United States, you're probably going to see more masks than you do in London. Right? I mean, it's just, the pubs, look at the pictures of the pubs in London last weekend. Nobody was wearing a mask. They were all completely cheek by jowl with each other, right? Bournemouth Beach, it was 10,000 people in this one strip of sand, right? So, it's not the only place where you have those behavioural responses. The violence in it, because it's laced with everything from sort of deep frustration, racism, etc., layered in different ways. I mean, the mask thing is often tied up with you people go back home, comments and all the rest of it, as we've seen. So, there's an American peculiarity to it. But, guess what? Other people can be stupid too. The other one, historically, is quite interesting. If you go back to the 1918 pandemic, they had all exactly the same thing going on.
Oh,
they had marches of people refusing to wear masks and saying it was a hoax and all this sort of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, part of it is because with the availability of digital media and everybody recording everything, you see things now more often that are shocking. But just because you didn't see them in the past or they weren't recorded in the past doesn't mean we didn't behave just as stupidly then.
Yeah, I like your point that other people around the world are just as dumb. This does take me to the Nanny State, and this, is connects to the Harper's letter as well. But I mean, the government usually controls negative externalities in some way. It makes me think we do need a nanny state. But then, I mean, we've gone too far, and where they're now trying to levy fines if you're not wearing a mask, and people just kind of roll their eyes. But it does make one wonder if there was someone different in the White House, if there had been some control, whether we would have all of these, outbursts of emotion around it.
Well, if you actually had a policy that we're going to try and do something consistent, we're going to stick to it because that's what consistency means, and we're going to follow what other people do that seems to be working, rather than it's not real, it'll all be gone, it's all the fault of the governors, we're doing great, we're only getting results because we keep testing people, etc. Of course it would make a difference, right? Yeah. How much of a difference? I mean, it seems to be the case that if you fire everything you've got all at once really early, lock down completely, then you get a great outcome. If you don't do that, you can end up with crappy outcomes. Spain has a second wave, right? Yeah. Italy might kick off. Britain's not looking so clever. And Sweden, despite all the hope for basically herd immunity, has a huge amount of death and very little herd immunity.
But they also have not had a huge impact on their economy, right?
No, actually they have, because everybody else around them has had an impact.
Yeah.
Right, and they live and die by exports, right? So they get just as stuffed as everybody else. So there's a kind of nationalistic fallacy in this that if we do this, we'll be fine. I mean, a good example is New Zealand. They're totally fine in terms of healthcare outcomes, but they have no tourists. Their international trade is completely constricted, right? I mean, they're going to take a massive hit economically, but they will not be dying of COVID.
So the big thing on the horizon, what we're talking about right now, is what's going to happen in the fall with schools and universities. So Brown has just announced that it's going to be a hybrid. A couple days before, Harvard had announced that they'll be on remote for the entire year. Princeton, I think, is doing freshmen, fall, seniors in the spring, sophomores and juniors get stuffed. What's your take on what's going to happen for K through 12, or I guess higher ed, but really K through 12, which is where the lines are really being drawn?
Well, the most important one is K through 12 in the sense that if you want to get people back to work, if the conditions allow it, then you have to be able to send the kids there. But, if you look, this is where the United States is different. So you have the president saying the schools must open. Okay, everybody else is kind of saying that, perhaps not exactly as angrily as he's saying it. But you know what they're doing? They're putting resources into it. So they're making it possible for the schools to open, whereas we just have someone shouting that it needs to happen in the midst of a depressed economy. So, that's the big difference. You're not actually helping, you're just shouting at people as usual, and that's the disappointing aspect.
I have a couple friends who are teachers, and they've been told by their districts to buy thermometers and Clorox wipes, since they'll be taking temperatures and cleaning their classrooms. And they're like, but there are no Clorox wipes anywhere, first of all. And so I'm now the medical professional as well. I mean, the stuff that the directives that they're being given is totally ludicrous.
Absolutely. And in other countries, they tend not to do that. They tend to recognize, we're trying to solve a public health problem. Let's not create one in our classrooms, but try and actually make the classrooms safe so that we can send the kids back. Whereas, as usual, we're just a public policy disaster.
Have you fallen back in love with, I'm going to try to pronounce it correctly, Angela Merkel? Is that anywhere close to it? No.
Angela Merkel. I mean, it's not that difficult. No,
I want to call her Angela, like McAllister.
Angie. No, the whole. I mean, basically, she's someone who's a pretty good communicator, who has a science background, who right at the start has been communicating clearly. I mean, basically, women leaders who can talk in sentences handle Corona well. That's pretty much it, with no drama, right? And so in that sense, it's the rebirth, right? And populist, because, their entire thing is foreigners are bad and you've been lied to and all the rest of it. They're not doing too well in the coronavirus era, because it turns out you do need things like experts and public health systems, or at least you do in countries other than the United States. We just shove ours off to the side when they become annoying. So has she, been reborn? Only to the extent that coronavirus has given, if you will, centre party leaders a second wind. But have they fallen back in love with her? Okay, so what has she done, right? There was meant to be this thing, a 750 billion bailout fund that was going to go to Italy. Yep. That's been watered down now and turned into a bunch of loans that nobody actually wants. The Italians have drawn a line in the sand in terms of conditionality. The Spanish are doing the same thing. The Dutch are saying, we're not paying for these people. And Merkel, rather than showing leadership, is basically sitting there looking for the lowest common denominator, which is what she always does. So, as usual, European countries are having variously good or bad crisis responses. The EU is doing exactly what it always does. Look for the lowest common denominator.
I mean, it was interesting, your point about women leaders. Hillary Clinton, in a recent interview, said the exact same thing. She said women leaders, and she listed off all the countries, are doing far better than male leaders.
Yeah, it's really true. It's really true. It's completely true. Yeah, absolutely.
I shouldn't, but I did. Bolsonaro tested positive, and I had a little, smile on my face, because he's been at the forefront of this is a hoax, this is, crap and blah, blah, blah. But then I saw on social media that he was then going to take hydroxychloroquine on social media to show that it was effective. And I thought, try that out and let's see how that goes.
My favorite one from him was he was in a press briefing admitting that he had it with a mask, and he took it off to then give the rest of the press briefing, thereby exposing everybody in the room. I mean, this is it. But it's this bit where it's like, there are no facts.
Yeah.
There really are no facts. There are only how I manage this room, this situation, how I make you feel. My election is the only important thing. That's pretty much it.
But I actually was surprised that they announced that he even had it, because I don't know that our president would, if he tested positive, whether or not we would ever hear about that. Because that would clearly be such a vulnerability for him, and he doesn't have any vulnerabilities.
Well, he doesn't seem to, actually. He's been around loads of people who have been infected, and he never seems to get infected.
Maybe he's that person that just has whatever antibodies and will never get it.
Well, there is some research on this. I mean, we analogize it to influenza, but last week, I think it was the British or someone recategorized the disease caused by COVID as cardiovascular, and really a vascular disease. What it does is it causes micro blood clots everywhere, and that's what really screws you up. So even we thought it was basically respiratory, right? And it turns out it's actually like mainly, vascular, but at least on that definition. But if you do stick with it as being a virus, I mean, it's more like the cold. So there's like a third of us, maybe we spoke about this last time, there's like a third of us that never get the cold.
Right. Yeah.
And and whether it's because we are microdosed with the virus or we have some kind of natural immunity or whatever, right? And it could be the case that Trump's just in that third of people who just would never get this. Like you put them in a room of it and it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And then other people get it and like the worst possible outcomes happen, which is kind of what makes it so unpredictable and scary. Gotta finish up soon, our little tour around the world. Have you been paying attention to China recently?
Oh, I mean, just a little bit, but not as much as I should.
Yes, exactly. So it's quite interesting. They're getting themselves into quite a pickle. So if you'd have sort of started back in 2016 when Trump was elected and he's railing against trade and all this sort of stuff, China's Xi comes out and goes to whatever it was, Davos or the WTO meeting or whatever, and says, we will defend globalization, this is what we do, whatever. And everyone went, oh, thank God there's an adult in the room, right? And then it turns out that like when you imprison 1 million people in basically re-education camps, right? When you tear up the Hong Kong Agreement and terrorize your population with threats of life imprisonment, when you run a giant spy ring abroad that is based around repatriating your nationals and in some cases giving them the option come home or commit suicide, right? When you really start to register on the buttons of all of the different intelligence services across Europe, when the Europeans themselves, even at the EU level, start to get really angry with you because you've been negotiating a trade agreement for 8 years and frankly you're taking the piss, they have no intention of signing anything and they just want to basically steal your tech. It turns out everyone's getting cross with China.
Who would have thought that the entire world would be against China?
And to me, the most interesting one in this is the Brits seem to be quite serious about offering 3 million people in Hong Kong British citizenship, which is a really big one because like China's super pissed about this, as you can imagine, right? And I can imagine the Brits at this point going, look, once we wean ourselves off of Huawei's 5G, which they're committed to doing, and we're not relying on them for funding that stupid nuclear power station we shouldn't be building anyway, what do we need them for?
But is it
Forget it.
Is it interesting that the UK, xenophobic UK, would want all of those foreigners in and welcome them to their borders?
Well, there's always been a weird British way of talking about the right type of immigrants.
I see.
And I think what that means is basically loads of massively entrepreneurial, loaded English-speaking people from Hong Kong. Totally fine. Totally fine.
They're the good ones, yeah.
They're the good ones, exactly.
But then does that ever, I mean, the cynic in me wonders whether that ever results in anything because, I mean, the pushback against China because China is so rich, they have so much. And is there, well, in this game of chicken, who backs down first?
Well, there's two camps on this, and apparently within China there are those people who are saying very quietly that Xi moved too far and too fast.
Yeah.
They're powerful, but they're not that powerful. And if you basically manage to get the EU and the US against you, when the EU should be your natural ally as the USA implodes and turns hyper-nationalistic, then they've really mismanaged it because they've got nowhere else to go. At the end of the day, they still rely on the United States being the net deficit in the system to the surplus that they're running.
Well, I guess it would be whether Xi exits stage left or they just disappear him in some way. That would be the signal. I mean, I have wondered whether he's going to get the boot pretty soon just for all these, mainly for COVID and just to put someone who's more trustworthy into the position.
Well, the whole Uyghur situation plays really bad for them. I mean, again, 10 years ago, it was technocratic China opening up to the world. You could wander around any of the cities. It seemed to be a functioning place, even though it wasn't democracy. And now there's 1 million people in jail.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, admittedly, the United States still has more people in jail than anybody else, but, putting that to one side for a minute, we don't do it just because they're Muslim.
We do it for other reasons similar.
We do it for other reasons, right.
But yes, totally, your point is taken. Is there anything out there that's not total doom and gloom?
No.
Okay. Well, I have a tiny one, but you
go on for it. Go on.
Well, I don't know if you watched Hamilton, but it seemed like, my very curated Twitter feed, everyone was watching Hamilton last weekend. But I just thought it was interesting because Aaron Burr is getting so much press right now. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court cited him in his decision for the Trump tax decision. The duel with Hamilton the anniversary is tomorrow, 216 years since that duel. And I just thought, someone dug up from American history that, we never would think twice about is really having his particular moment.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about Hamilton in a different way. First of all, I wasn't watching it, but I was watching some of the commentary around it, and I was just waiting for cancel Hamilton, and of course it came along, right? And I started, just spent 10 minutes looking into this, and the argument seems to be one which, if you scratch beneath the surface, really is just disappointment. So, when this thing's launched, right, this is this remarkable thing where basically African American and other minority cultural influences are put together into this most traditional of white musical forms with multicultural actors and so on and so forth. And it was brilliant, right? And in a sense, it was kind of like what the Obama coalition thought, the intellectual elite of the Obama coalition thought the world should look like, right? That was it. And now clearly after 4 years of Trump, that dream is shattered or whatever. And all of that was like meant to be good has been, it's gone. It no longer matters, right? Yeah. It's just the fact that like this is just another vehicle of cultural oppression, and you do get to the point you're like, yeah, but it was a really good musical.
The music was good. I mean, I'm just gonna annoy you because I liked it, but I also thought women are still in these super gendered roles. Like, if you're going to make Thomas Jefferson a black man, why not make him a black woman? I mean, if we're going to think about reimagining a musical, like, those would be ways that I would do it.
Yeah, but have it one reimagining at a time.
Okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. No, but I mean, just like, letting it all go. Yes, it's great.
Yeah, but no, I did love the Twitter comment. Just somebody said, "Oh my God, 5 years ago, the same people who are wanting to cancel thought this was the greatest thing in the world." And it's absolutely true. So much of this is just disappointment. We're all just angry and disappointed for our own very different reasons.
Yes. So on that wonderful high note.
On that happy note, yes, exactly.
And disappointment. Well, stay safe, take care. Talk to you in a couple of weeks. Thank you for listening,
Indeed.
everyone.
Bye.